The ship arrived before sunrise. Its wooden hull creaked against the harbor docks as chains rattled in the darkness. On board were dozens of women, terrified, exhausted, and silent. Only days earlier they had been daughters, wives, sisters, living ordinary lives somewhere across the Mediterranean. But now they were cargo. By the time the sun rose over the island of Delos, many of them would be standing naked on stone platforms while strangers inspected their bodies, negotiated prices, and decided their fate. And what happened to these women after that moment would reveal one of the darkest and most brutal industries of the ancient world. But the true horror of Delos was not just that it was a slave market. It was that it became the largest slave market in the entire Mediterranean, a place where tens of thousands of human beings could be bought and sold in a single day. Ancient writers claimed that at its peak, more than 10,000 slaves passed through its markets daily. Pirates, merchants, generals, and wealthy Romans all came here with one purpose: to turn human suffering into profit. And among the most vulnerable victims were captured women. Their stories were rarely written down. Their names disappeared into silence. But fragments of their experiences still survive, hidden within ancient records, archaeological discoveries, and the accounts of Roman historians who briefly described what happened on this island. To understand why Delos became a center of human trafficking on such a massive scale, we must go back to a time when the Mediterranean world was exploding with wealth, conquest, and power. It was the 2nd century before Christ, and the Roman Republic was expanding faster than ever before. Roman armies had crushed powerful kingdoms, defeated rival empires, and turned vast territories into Roman provinces. War had become almost constant. Legions marched across Greece, Asia Minor, North Africa, and Spain, and wherever Roman armies went, prisoners followed. Defeated soldiers, civilians, villagers, and entire populations were often enslaved after conquest. Women were especially vulnerable. When cities fell, chaos erupted. Homes were looted, families separated, and captives were dragged away in chains. Many of them would eventually arrive at places like Delos. But Delos was not always a center of slavery. In earlier centuries, it had been famous for something very different. According to Greek mythology, Delos was the sacred birthplace of the gods Apollo and Artemis. For generations, the island had been considered holy ground. Pilgrims came to worship at magnificent temples, and Greek cities donated statues and offerings to honor the gods. But history has a way of transforming sacred places into something far darker. In 167 BCE, the Roman Senate made a decision that would change Delos forever. They declared the island a free port. That meant merchants could trade goods there without paying taxes. The result was explosive. Ships from every corner of the Mediterranean began arriving at Delos. Traders brought wine, grain, spices, gold, silk, and luxury goods from distant lands. The harbor quickly became one of the busiest commercial centers in the ancient world. And with trade came opportunity. Merchants soon realized that Delos was perfectly positioned for another kind of business. It was located near major sea routes, close to regions where piracy was common, and easily accessible to Roman buyers looking for labor. Before long, Delos became the largest slave market in the Mediterranean. Everything was about to change. Pirates began raiding coastal towns with increasing frequency. Their attacks were swift and brutal. Small villages woke to the sound of screaming and fire as ships appeared on the horizon. Armed raiders stormed ashore, capturing anyone they could seize. Men were often killed if they resisted, but women and children were usually taken alive. The captives were tied together with ropes or chains and forced onto ships. The journey across the sea was terrifying. Many had no idea where they were being taken. Some believed they would be executed. Others hoped they might eventually be released, but most were heading toward Delos. For many women, the first glimpse of the island brought no relief. From the sea, Delos looked magnificent. White temples rose above the harbor, marble statues gleamed in the sunlight, and wealthy merchants walked along busy docks filled with cargo. Yet hidden within this thriving port was a marketplace unlike any other. Rows of stone platforms stood in open squares where slaves were displayed for buyers. Captives were often forced to stand naked or nearly naked so purchasers could inspect their bodies. Merchants examined teeth, muscles, skin, and hair as if they were judging livestock. A healthy body meant a higher price. But for women, the evaluation could be even more invasive. Buyers looked closely for signs of youth, beauty, and fertility. Wealthy Romans searching for household servants or concubines carefully studied each captive. Some women were forced to answer questions about their origins, their skills, and whether they had ever borne children. Those who could not speak Greek or Latin often remained silent, unable to understand the negotiations that would determine their fate. Everything about the market was designed to turn human lives into numbers. A merchant might shout a price, a buyer would counter, coins exchanged hands, and within minutes, a woman's entire future could change. But the story did not end there, because what happened after the sale could be even more terrifying. Some women were purchased by wealthy households in Rome or other cities. They became domestic servants, cooks, nurses, or personal attendants. Their lives were controlled entirely by their owners, but in some cases conditions were relatively stable. Others were not so fortunate. Many were sold into prostitution. Brothels across the Mediterranean demanded a constant supply of enslaved women. Slave traders knew this, and often targeted young captives who could be sold for higher prices. For these women, Delos was only the beginning of a nightmare. But there was another terrifying possibility awaiting many female captives. They could be resold repeatedly. Slave traders often purchased groups of women in Delos and transported them to other markets where prices were higher. Cities like Rome, Corinth, and Ephesus had enormous demand for slaves. This meant a woman captured in one region might be sold several times before reaching her final destination. Each sale meant new uncertainty, new dangers, and new masters. And sometimes the journey itself was deadly. Slave ships were often overcrowded. Captives were packed tightly below deck with little food or water. Disease spread quickly in such conditions, and many prisoners died before reaching land. Yet the trade continued to expand. Because for the merchants who controlled it, the profits were enormous. Delos became a place where fortunes were made overnight. Roman businessmen invested heavily in slave trading operations. Pirates supplied captives, merchants transported them, and brokers organized the auctions. Every stage of the process generated wealth. But behind that wealth were countless untold tragedies. And one of the most disturbing realities of the Delos market was how easily entire families were destroyed. When captives arrived, they were usually separated immediately. Mothers were pulled away from daughters. Sisters were divided. Children were sold to different buyers. Ancient historians rarely describe these moments in detail, but archaeological evidence and scattered texts suggest that scenes of grief were common. Imagine standing in a crowded marketplace, surrounded by strangers speaking unfamiliar languages. Imagine knowing that within minutes you could be taken to another country, another city, another life. And there was nothing you could do to stop it. But there was something even darker happening behind the scenes, because not all slave traders waited for war or piracy to supply their markets. Some merchants actively encouraged raids. Pirates who captured large numbers of prisoners could sell them quickly at Delos with minimal questions asked. The island's enormous demand for slaves meant that origin rarely mattered. This created a vicious cycle. More demand meant more raids. More raids meant more captives. And more captives meant more suffering. But even as Delos became infamous for slavery, something else was happening across the Mediterranean. Rome itself was becoming dangerously dependent on enslaved labor. Huge agricultural estates called latifundia were spreading across Italy. Wealthy landowners needed thousands of workers to maintain farms, vineyards, and mines. Slaves provided that labor. This demand fueled the expansion of markets like Delos, and it would eventually lead to one of the most violent uprisings in Roman history. Because the people being sold in these markets were not always passive victims. Some resisted, some escaped, and some fought back. One of the most famous rebellions would erupt decades later under the leadership of a gladiator named Spartacus. But long before that revolt shocked Rome, the suffering experienced by enslaved women in markets like Delos had already shaped the social fabric of the ancient world. Their labor supported wealthy households, their exploitation enriched merchants. And their stories, though rarely recorded, reveal the hidden human cost of Mediterranean power and prosperity. But the darkest chapter of Delos was still approaching, because eventually the slave trade would grow so large that the island could process thousands of captives in a single day. And the methods used to control, display, and transport these human beings would become even more brutal. Yet at the height of its power, few people questioned the system. To many wealthy Romans, slavery was simply part of life, and Delos remained one of its most profitable centers. But no empire lasts forever, and the island that once dominated the slave trade would eventually face a devastating collapse. What caused the downfall of this massive market, and what happened to the countless enslaved women whose lives passed through it, is a story far more shocking than most people realize. The sun climbed slowly over the Aegean Sea, casting long golden reflections across the harbor of Delos. From a distance the island looked prosperous, almost beautiful. Marble temples shimmered under the light, merchant ships crowded the docks, and traders shouted over the noise of creaking ropes and crashing waves. To visiting merchants, Delos appeared to be a place of endless opportunity. But beneath that prosperity was a constant flow of human suffering. Ships continued to arrive almost daily, carrying captives from every corner of the Mediterranean. Some came from Greek islands devastated by pirate raids. Others had been captured during wars fought by expanding empires. Still others had been kidnapped from quiet coastal towns that had never imagined becoming targets. And among those prisoners were countless women whose lives had been torn apart in a single violent moment. The process began long before they ever reached Delos. Imagine a quiet village along the coast of Asia Minor. Fishermen prepare their nets before sunrise. Families wake slowly as the first light spreads across the sea. Children run through narrow streets between stone houses while merchants open their small shops. Then, without warning, ships appear on the horizon. At first they might look like ordinary trading vessels. But as they move closer, something becomes clear. These ships are moving too fast, and the men aboard them are heavily armed. Panic spreads quickly. Villagers run toward the shore hoping to defend their homes, but the raiders are already landing. Pirates storm onto the beach carrying swords and spears. They move quickly, shouting orders, dragging people from houses, tying prisoners together. Anyone who resists may be killed instantly. But many captives are spared for a simple reason. They are more valuable alive. Women are often among the first to be seized. Pirates know that young captives can bring high prices in slave markets. They are bound with rope, forced to march toward the ships, and pushed into dark cargo holds. The entire raid may last less than an hour. By the time the pirates leave, homes are burning, families are shattered, and the captured villagers are already sailing away. For the prisoners, the journey across the sea is only the beginning. Slave ships were rarely designed to carry large numbers of people. Captives were crowded tightly below deck where air was scarce and movement almost impossible. The smell of sweat, fear, and sickness filled the dark space. Some prisoners cried out for help. Others sat silently in shock. Many had no idea where they were being taken. Days passed slowly as the ship crossed the Mediterranean. Food was minimal, usually small portions of bread or dried grain. Water was rationed carefully. Anyone who became too weak or sick could be thrown overboard without hesitation. To the slave traders, every captive represented profit, but they were also replaceable. Eventually the ships approached the island that had become the center of this brutal trade, Delos. As the vessels entered the harbor, the captives would finally see where they had been brought. Rows of merchant ships crowded the docks. Traders moved quickly through the port carrying ledgers, coins, and contracts. Crates of goods were unloaded constantly. Wine from Italy, spices from the East, fabrics from Egypt. But the most valuable cargo was human. The captives were marched off the ships and herded toward the marketplace. And this was the moment when fear often became overwhelming, because the slave market of Delos was designed to display human beings as commodities. Large open squares were surrounded by colonnades and merchant stalls. Platforms made of stone or wood stood in central areas where slaves could be presented to buyers. Brokers shouted prices while potential purchasers examined the captives closely. Women were often forced to stand in front of crowds while buyers evaluated them. Some traders attached small tags around the necks of their slaves describing age, origin, and skills. These labels were meant to increase the chances of a profitable sale. But not all information was truthful. Merchants frequently exaggerated the abilities or health of their captives. A woman might be described as a skilled household servant, even if she had never worked in such a role. Others were falsely claimed to be younger than they actually were. Buyers knew this deception was common, so they conducted their own inspections. The scene could be humiliating and terrifying. Wealthy buyers approached the platforms and studied the captives carefully. They examined teeth, skin, hair, and posture. Some asked questions through translators. Others simply watched silently before making an offer. For women, appearance often determined everything. Youth and beauty dramatically increased a slave's value. A healthy young woman might be purchased for a wealthy Roman household where she would work as a personal attendant or companion. But other buyers had very different intentions. Some were brothel owners searching for new workers. Others were slave traders who planned to transport the captives to even larger markets like Rome. In those moments on the platform, a woman's entire life could be decided by a single negotiation. Coins exchanged hands, and just like that, she belonged to someone else. But there was another part of the slave market that most outsiders never saw. Behind the public auctions existed private negotiations. Wealthy clients sometimes preferred to avoid the crowds and conduct purchases in secluded areas. Brokers arranged meetings where elite buyers could examine selected captives away from public view. For female slaves, these private sales could be especially dangerous, because they often involved buyers searching for personal concubines. In Roman society, enslaved women were considered property, which meant owners had complete control over them. There were no legal protections preventing exploitation. A slave owner could force a woman into labor, servitude, or sexual submission without consequence. This reality created enormous demand among wealthy Roman men, and slave traders on Delos were well aware of it. But not every woman accepted her fate quietly. Some resisted. Some attempted to escape even within the crowded markets. Ancient accounts mention incidents where captives tried to run from the auction platforms or attacked their captors in desperation. But such attempts rarely succeeded. Guards were stationed throughout the market to prevent escapes. Anyone who fought back too aggressively could be beaten or killed as a warning to others. Yet even within this harsh system, small acts of defiance sometimes appeared. Some women refused to answer questions from buyers. Others deliberately presented themselves poorly in hopes of being passed over by certain purchasers. These acts rarely changed their fate, but they revealed a truth often ignored by ancient writers. The enslaved were not simply passive victims. They were human beings struggling to survive within an unforgiving system. Meanwhile, the business of Delos continued expanding. At its peak, the market was so large that ancient writers described astonishing numbers. The historian Strabo claimed that up to 10,000 slaves could be sold in a single day on the island. Whether the exact number was exaggerated or not, the scale of the trade was undeniable. Delos had become the beating heart of Mediterranean slavery, and Rome's appetite for labor showed no sign of slowing. Massive agricultural estates across Italy required constant supplies of workers. Mines in Spain and Greece demanded thousands of slaves to extract valuable metals. Urban households needed servants to maintain luxurious lifestyles. Each of these industries depended on markets like Delos. But something else was beginning to change across the Mediterranean. Piracy was growing out of control. For decades, pirates had operated along remote coastlines, capturing ships and raiding towns. But by the 1st century BCE, their power had expanded dramatically. Pirate fleets controlled entire regions of the sea. They attacked merchant vessels, kidnapped wealthy travelers, and disrupted trade routes. Even Roman officials began to feel threatened. At one point, pirates became so bold that they captured Roman senators and demanded ransom for their release. The Mediterranean itself was starting to feel unsafe, and yet ironically, the slave market of Delos benefited from this chaos. Because piracy meant more captives. More captives meant more profits, but the Roman Republic could not tolerate this situation forever. Eventually, Rome would launch one of the largest anti-piracy campaigns in ancient history, and when that campaign succeeded, it would change the fate of Delos forever. But before the island's slave empire collapsed, thousands more captives would pass through its markets. Among them were women whose stories were never recorded. Women who vanished into Roman households, distant cities, and unknown futures. Yet their experiences reveal a hidden truth about the ancient world. The wealth of powerful empires often rested on invisible suffering, and Delos was one of the clearest examples of that reality. But the final chapter of this story is even more dramatic, because the island that once processed thousands of slaves every day would eventually face destruction, abandonment, and silence. And when Delos finally fell, the echoes of its brutal marketplace would remain buried beneath its ruins. The marketplace of Delos never truly slept. Even after sunset, when the blazing Mediterranean sun disappeared behind the horizon, activity continued across the harbor. Torches flickered along the docks, casting long shadows across the stone streets as merchants counted their profits and ships prepared to depart for distant ports. Somewhere in the darkness, chains clinked softly as newly purchased slaves were marched toward waiting vessels. For the women who had been sold that day, the night often brought a terrifying realization. Their journey was not over. Delos was rarely the final destination. Instead, it was a crossroads, a place where human lives were sorted, priced, and redistributed across an empire that stretched thousands of miles. The buyers who had purchased them in the marketplace might already be preparing to transport them somewhere else. To Rome, to Corinth, to Alexandria, or to places they had never even heard of. And as the ships left Delos under the cover of darkness, the future of those women grew more uncertain with every mile of open sea. Some were taken to wealthy Roman villas where they would serve in luxurious households. These homes were enormous estates filled with dozens or even hundreds of slaves performing every imaginable task. Some prepared food in large kitchens. Others cleaned marble floors, carried water, cared for children, or maintained gardens. For certain women, This life meant long hours of labor but relative stability. A household slave who proved loyal and skilled could sometimes earn small privileges. Occasionally, after many years of service, a slave might even be granted freedom. But those stories were rare, and for many women captured and sold through Delos, their fate was far harsher. Because the Roman world had an insatiable appetite for entertainment, luxury, and pleasure, and enslaved women were often forced to provide all three. Some were taken to brothels in the bustling cities of the empire. These establishments ranged from small street houses to large buildings that operated day and night. Enslaved women working there had no control over their bodies or their lives. Owners demanded constant labor, and resistance was punished severely. Others were purchased by elite Roman men who kept enslaved women as personal companions or concubines. In Roman society, this practice was widely accepted. Wealthy men often owned dozens of slaves, and female slaves were frequently expected to satisfy their masters' desires. For these women, survival depended on obedience. But even in such oppressive conditions, history reveals that some women found ways to resist quietly. A few formed secret friendships with other slaves inside households, creating small communities of support. Others learned valuable skills, music, language, reading, which sometimes increased their importance within a household. Occasionally, an enslaved woman who gained the trust of her master might be granted manumission, the legal process of freedom. Yet freedom did not erase the past. A former slave still carried the mark of her history, and opportunities remained limited. But there were darker destinies still waiting for many women captured in the markets of Delos. Some were transported to agricultural estates known as latifundia. These massive farms covered vast areas of land across Italy and the provinces. Thousands of slaves worked under brutal conditions, cultivating crops like olives, wheat, and grapes. Although men often performed the heaviest physical labor, women on these estates endured exhausting work as well. They planted crops, processed harvests, and maintained food supplies for the slave population. Life on these estates was harsh and tightly controlled. Slave overseers used violence to maintain order, and escape was extremely difficult. And yet, beneath the surface of this system, tension was growing, because Rome's reliance on slave labor had created a society filled with inequality and resentment. The number of enslaved people in the Roman world had grown enormously. In some regions, slaves outnumbered free citizens. Entire industries depended on their labor, yet they had no rights, no voice, and no protection. This imbalance made rebellion inevitable. And when it came, it would shake the Roman Republic to its core. But long before the famous slave revolt led by Spartacus erupted in southern Italy, smaller acts of resistance were already occurring throughout the empire. Some slaves ran away and joined outlaw communities hiding in mountains or forests. Others sabotaged tools, damaged crops, or slowed their work in subtle acts of defiance. And occasionally, entire groups of slaves rose up against their masters. Roman authorities feared these uprisings deeply, because they understood a terrifying truth. If the enslaved population ever united in large numbers, the consequences could be catastrophic. Yet despite these fears, the demand for slaves continued to grow, and Delos remained one of the central engines driving that system. Year after year, ships continued arriving with new captives. The marketplaces filled with buyers. The auctions continued. But something was beginning to change beyond the island. The Mediterranean was becoming increasingly unstable. Pirates had grown more powerful than ever before. Entire fleets roamed the sea, attacking merchant vessels, capturing travelers, and even threatening Roman coastal towns. Trade routes became dangerous, and the Roman Senate could no longer ignore the crisis. Finally, Rome decided to act. In 67 BCE, a Roman general named Pompey was given extraordinary authority to eliminate piracy across the Mediterranean. With massive resources and a powerful fleet, Pompey launched one of the largest military operations in ancient history. His campaign moved quickly and decisively. Pirate strongholds were attacked, fleets were destroyed, thousands of pirates surrendered or were captured. Within months, the once dominant pirate networks had been shattered. At first, this victory seemed like a triumph for stability and trade, but it also had an unexpected consequence. Without pirates capturing large numbers of people along the coasts, the supply of slaves began to shrink. Markets that depended on a constant flow of captives started to struggle, and Delos, which had grown wealthy through this trade, suddenly faced an uncertain future. But piracy was not the only threat facing the island. Political conflicts were spreading across the eastern Mediterranean. Rival kingdoms, rebellious cities, and shifting alliances created waves of violence that disrupted commerce. Then disaster struck. In the 1st century BCE, Delos was attacked and devastated during regional conflicts involving forces from the Kingdom of Pontus. The once thriving commercial hub was looted and damaged. Many merchants abandoned the island, and its economic importance began to collapse. The great slave markets that had once processed thousands of human beings every day fell silent. Ships stopped arriving in such numbers. Merchants moved their operations to other cities. Gradually, Delos faded from prominence. The temples remained. The marble statues still stood beneath the Mediterranean sun. But the bustling markets were gone, and the voices of the countless captives who had passed through the island disappeared into history. Today, the ruins of Delos lie quiet and empty. Visitors walk among the ancient streets where merchants once shouted prices and ships once unloaded their human cargo. Stone platforms remain where slaves were displayed to buyers thousands of years ago. But the people whose lives were shaped by those moments left behind almost no records. Their names were rarely written down. Their stories were rarely preserved. Yet their experiences reveal something deeply important about the ancient world. Behind the glory of empires, the wealth of merchants, and the grandeur of temples existed a hidden system of exploitation that shaped entire civilizations. The slave market of Delos was one of the clearest symbols of that system. A place where thousands of lives changed in a single day. A place where captured women faced terrifying uncertainty. And a place that reminds us how easily human suffering can become invisible when it is woven into the fabric of power and prosperity. Because history often remembers emperors, generals, and kings, but the true cost of their world was carried by people whose voices were almost never heard. Women who stood in crowded markets far from home. Women who were sold to strangers. Women whose futures were decided with a handful of coins. Their stories may have been buried beneath the ruins of Delos, but the echoes of their lives still remain. In the silent stones, in the broken marketplaces, and in the reminder that every great civilization carries shadows within its history. The island that once sold thousands of human beings every day now stands empty beneath the same Mediterranean sky. And perhaps that silence says more than any ancient record ever could.